Stud was actually the first game I learned how to play. The first game I played was actually 5-card stud with my grandfather when I was 8 years old. He taught me the rules. We took out the penny jar, and he taught me how to play. But he actually would cheat me because he didn't want me to play poker. So I never actually beat him. And until later on, he told me how he would cheat me and what he would do. And we laughed about it later. But coming from the East Coast, stud is the game that they play the most in the poker room. So that's the game I just gravitated towards and the game I've given the most thought. It's a very complicated and complex game, which most players think is a very simple game, but they're just flat out wrong. And at the highest level of stud, it becomes it's just such a beautiful, amazing game. So many little intricacies, so difficult to master that I think it's one of the best forms of poker there is. So I really think people should take the stud seriously, try to learn how to play as much as they possibly can. And what that will do is that will give them a bigger appreciation of poker and help the no limit hold'em game out in the long run. Seven-card stud is a game played by up to 8 players, and is usually played with a limit betting structure. In a 2,000-4,000 game, the first 2 rounds of betting are in increments of 2,000, and the final 3 betting rounds are in increments of 4,000. Each player is dealt 7 cards throughout the course of the hand, but only the best 5-card hand possible for each player is used to determine the winning hand. Before the hand begins, each player must put in an ante. Each player is dealt 2 whole cards and a third face up. The lowest exposed card is the bring-in and is forced to start the action with either a nominal bet or a full small bet. This round of betting is known as Third Street. Each remaining player receives another exposed card, called Fourth Street, and the player with the highest ranking poker hand exposed begins the round of betting. On Fifth Street, a third exposed card is dealt to each remaining player. Starting on Fifth Street, the betting increment increases to the size of the big bet. And on 6th Street, a fourth exposed card is dealt. Once again, the player with the highest ranking poker hand bets first. On 7th Street, each remaining player is dealt a final 7th card face down. Once again, the player with the strongest hand exposed bets first, and this is the final round of betting. If you want to see a full breakdown of hand rankings, check out the workbook. First thing you need to do is when you're considering whether or not to play a hand, is to keep track of all the up cards. If it's 8 hand, you need to keep track of the 8 cards that are up. That takes a little bit of practice. You'll get used to it. There's tricks, you just remember the amount of suits out there. The common cards, things like that. That's what really matters the most. Say you get dealt 3 hearts, but there's 3 other hearts on board or 4 other hearts on board, you probably shouldn't go for a flush. You need to keep in mind that the up cards do matter. If you start with a pair, say you have a pair of 8s and there's another 8 out, it's less likely you're going to make trips. You need to be more prone to fold that hand. I mean, if you have the highest card up, then you would probably raise. If you have the pair of 8s you have the highest card up, even though there's 8 out, you would raise. So you just have to keep in mind the up cards. It's really important in the game. The most important things are the position, just like in no limit hold'em. The chances if someone's raising in front of you, if they're stealing. So that's why you really have to pay attention to the board. If they see that there's, common cards out, they may more likely be stealing. Also, your hand. I mean, if you have if you have a pair higher than a board, you should raise in those spots. You need to know when to re-raise. Like if someone has a jack up and you have 2 9s, and that comes from the likelihood of whether or not they're stealing or not. So if it's a good chance that they're stealing with the jack up because it's the highest card out, then sometimes you should re-raise. If there's a chance that they might not be stealing, then sometimes you should call. If there's this chance, like there's no way they're stealing, and there's like a queen, a king, an ace behind you, and they're raising with a jack, and it's a tight player, then you should fold the 9s. So you just need to really take into account the board and how your opponent's playing. If it's folding around to your opponent, he has an ace up and there's a jack, an 8, and a 3 behind him, and he's folding in that spot a lot, and all of a sudden he raises, he probably has a good hand. So you need to pay attention to the frequency of how much they're stealing, and what hands they're playing, and things like this. A straight draw on 3rd Street would be like, say you have a 8, 9, 10 dealt to you. That becomes a lot more trickier than, say, a flush draw, because now what I think people really don't look at enough is 2 cards on both sides. So if I have 8, 9, 10, I look at the amount of 6s and 7s that are out and the amount of jacks and queens that are out. I think that's, really important. I think a lot of people look at the jacks, and if they have 8, 9, 10, they'll look at the jacks and the 8s that are out, but they don't pay attention to the queens and the 7s. And, you need those cards to complete a straight. You don't really know which direction you're going to go, which cards you're going to hit. So you really need to be paying attention to, all the up cards. See if your hand has value, figuring out what's being raised in front of you, the likelihood of them having a pair. I mean, sometimes a jack may raise in front of you. They have a pair of jacks, so your 8, 9, 10 has significantly less value. Or sometimes they'll raise a 6 in front of you. Now your 8, 9, 10 is much stronger. So it won't really matter as much if, say, some queens are out or some 7s are out, because you have a way of making an overpair to what they're representing, which would be a pair of 6s. If people come from a online background, from playing poker online, or a hold'em background, it becomes very difficult to really keep track of the cards that are up, because it's just something they're not used to, something they don't practice. So they end up going after hands where they're drawing very slim because their cards are already used, their cards are already out. So you just need to be careful to avoid those traps. The split pairs, meaning you have say you have a pair of 10s, and you have a 10 up and a 10 in the hole with, say, a 5. That's a split pair. A pocket pair would mean you have like a 5 up and 2 10s in the hole. So it's much better to have a pocket pair, because if you catch a 10, no one knows you have 3 of a kind. So it makes your hand much more sneakier and much better. The nice thing about stud is the up cards. So you sometimes you can tell whether or not you have an inferior draw based off of the way your opponent's been playing. If your opponent's playing tight and he has 2 clubs on board and he's calling a lot of raises, then there's a good chance he has a flush draw. And if you can see those clubs are higher than your cards in the hole, then you may have an inferior draw. That doesn't mean you should fold though in stud. It's not like hold'em where, like, if you have a smaller flush draw than someone, you're in really bad shape. In stud, it's not like they have to hit and you're still usually getting the right price to continue. A no-limit scenario would be your opponent has an ace-high flush draw and you have a queen-high flush draw. So you have queen, jack of heart, and your opponent has ace, king of heart. And there's 6, 7 of heart and 3 of spades on board. Now you got a severe disadvantage, because if a heart hits, he's going to make a bigger flush from you. So these are situations you need to really be careful of in no-limit hold'em. In stud, sometimes you're getting great pot odds. So if you have a worse flush draw than your opponent, or if you think you have a worse flush draw, then you should continue, because sometimes, even though you think you may have a worse flush draw, he may not even have a flush draw, or you're getting the right price to continue calling anyway. The difference is the amount of outs you have available. So again, there's 13 cards in a suit. So if you start with 3 to a flush and there's no other flush cards out, your flush draw is much more likely to get there. You have a much better hand than you would if, say, 2 other hearts are out or 3 other hearts are out. Your hand sometimes becomes unplayable based off the betting and the raising in front of you. A 3 flush is when you get dealt 2 hearts in a hole and a heart on as your up card. So you get dealt a 3 a heart, a 7 a heart, and a 10 a heart as your up card. Because remember, you get two cards dealt down, 1 card dealt up. That's a 3 flush. You should play 3 flushes based off of the amount of other hearts that are out. Also, the amount of other live cards that are out to go with your 3 flush. So, like, say you start with 10, 7, 3, and there's a lot of 7s and 3s out and a couple 10s, and say there's a heart, okay, and your opponent opens with a jack, your next one to go. Then I would be more likely to fold. Because a lot of times you'll backdoor hands too. You'll start with 10, 7, 3 a heart, and you'll make 3 sevens, or you'll make 2 pair, and you'll end up winning the hand that way. Well, you should definitely play a 3 flush when you have a card that's higher than the card that they're opening. Okay, so say they're opening with a jack, and you have a 9 a heart on board with a 4 a heart and a queen a heart. Okay, and there's no queens out. So now not only can you make another heart to give yourself a 4 flush, which potentially you can make a flush, but you also can make a queen, which gives yourself usually a better hand than them. You'll make a pair of queens. So you definitely should play a 3 flush in those situations. And you should probably almost always play 3 flush if there's no other hearts out on the board. So you just need to take all those things into consideration before you decide to play a 3 flush. Your kicker is very important, especially if your hand's live. Say someone raises with a 10 and you have 2 6s with a king. That's much stronger than having 2 6s with a 3, because now if you catch a king, you have kings and 6s. Versus if you catch if you had 2 6 with a 3 and you catch a 3, now you have 6s and 3s. So now if they have 10s, you can very easily be beat. Whereas if you catch a king, you have a very strong hand now, and it's very tough for them to beat you if they started with 2 10s. You need to be able to steal the antes, because the antes are very big in stud. Remember, if you're playing 8-handed, and I'm just going to use 2 and 4,000 as an example, because that's the limit that we play a lot. Sometimes we play 4 and 8, but say there's a $500 ante, so there's 8 players, so there's already 4,000 in the middle, plus the bring in, so there's already 4,500 in the middle. So your initial raise is to 2,000, so you're getting over 2 to 1 on your first steal, right? So there are times where there are, automatic raises where, you just raise because you have the high card up and there's low cards behind you, or especially if there's common cards behind you. Say you have a 9 up and there's 2 kings behind you and there's maybe another king folded. You may raise because it's unlikely that they have a hand that they could play. So there's situations that come up where, you have to raise and try to steal the antes. As the hand gets dealt, the position changes because the high card is the one who acts first. So, like in Nolan and Hold'em, the position is automatically to the left of the button. So your position changes based off what gets dealt to you. And a lot of times your bluffs based off of the strength of your board. So, if you're on a bluff and you have a jack up and you have, like, say, 4-3 in a hole and you catch a suited 10, you may continue bluffing. If you catch a deuce, you may just check and give up, based off of the situation. Because a lot of times you're raising with, like, jack, queen, king, or you're raising with ace, jack, 10, or you're raising with jack, 9, 8. You're raising with, 3 decent-sized cards. So that 10 kind of connects with everything. If you were on a 3 flush, now you have 4 hearts. If you're on a straight draw, you either made a 4 straight or you made a pair. So that would be a good time to continue betting. My approach to the bring-in changes based off of the likelihood that my opponent doesn't have it. Say I'm bringing in with a deuce, and I have 2 deuces with a 10. Okay, and someone raises up front with an ace. If the board behind them is live, say he opens with an ace, and the board behind him is live, and I have 2 deuces with a 10, I'm probably going to fold. If the board behind him is like, there's a couple 8s, couple 7s, there's a good chance he's bluffing, then I'm probably going to defend. That's my reasoning of, defending with these hands and sometimes just throwing them away. Now, if I have a hand like 2 deuces with a 10, and I have deuce 10 a heart in a hole, and there's no hearts on the board, and and I think he may have it, I'm probably going to defend with that hand. Live board means that your cards are very live, so that makes it very likely of you hitting the hand. Let's say you have a hand like 5, 6, 7, 8, and you have, say, 7, 8 on board, 5, 6 in a hole, and there's no 4s or 9s available. That means your hand's very live. You have a very good chance of making it, because you got to remember there's all those cards that are already been dealt out, plus 4th street, depending upon how many players are in, and you still have 8 cards available. You have to really execute your bluffs well, and you have to think that your opponent thinks that you have a hand, okay, in order for these bluffs to work. And these bluffs are not going to work as much. It's not a big deal if it doesn't work, because you're getting such a big price on executing the bluff. When it does work, you're getting, you're picking up 15, 16 bets for 1 bet, okay? So it's not a big deal if you get caught. You're going to get caught more often because you're supposed to. It's more of an opportunity to get them to fold on 5th Street than the river. Usually once they call 5th Street, they're going to call 6th Street. So you really need to keep that in mind. So sometimes if you are betting, sometimes it's good to check and fold on 6th Street if you have nothing, because once they call 5th Street, they're going to call 6th Street, and they're probably going to call the river if they have a hand, if they're not on a draw. But again, that's why I like to value bet a lot of hands in stud, because it sets up my bluffs. If you're never betting 1 pair on the river, then it's much more difficult to bluff on the river. Some 7th Street spots where you can try some bluffs is where you think your opponent's on a draw. You think they have a 4 flush, and they need to hit it, or they have a 4 straight and they need to hit it. So you could bet, and if they miss, usually they'll fold. Those are some bluffs you can make. Or if you think they have a small pair and you have 4 cards higher than their pair on board, that's usually a good opportunity to bluff, because they're trying to make 2 pair usually. So you have a pretty good chance of winning those hands. Also, there's some spots where that they know you have a draw, so they may bet, and then you can raise, pretend like you hit it. I think those are some of the key spots for bluffing a stud. The reason why more tails show up in stud is because when the up card hits, so you can see their body language a lot more. You're getting 4 up cards, okay, after they look at their whole cards, and every time they're looking at the whole card, sometimes they have to check back at their whole cards to see if they have a flush draw, they have a straight draw. They have to keep looking back at their hand. And hold them, you need to look at your hand once, maybe, sometimes twice, depending, upon the player. A really good player doesn't really need to look back at his cards. So you see, you get to spot a lot of tells. A lot of times the way player handle the up cards and studs, you can tell their experience from the game. If a guy's grabbing his up cards, snapping it down, cuffing them together, that they played some stud before. If they're looking at the cards, not doing much with their up card, a lot of times they are inexperienced in the game. So you kind of tell how much experience they have with the game. If they're keeping the cards organized when they get dealt, that they've played quite a bit of stud. Sometimes by the pace of their play, if they're playing pretty fast, they know the decisions right away. Everything's a pretty clear decision to them. If something looks difficult, you see them glancing around the board and paying attention to the up cards. If you see a person just focus on their hand, that they're not really too seasoned of a player, or they're kind of new to the game. A lot of times, some people grab the card right away and put it next to them if the card means something to them. If it doesn't mean anything, they miss completely, they'll just leave it there, or sometimes it's vice versa. So you just need to pay attention to these little details to try to gather as much information as you can about the strength of their hand. By the time 5th Street comes, you've probably seen 12, 13, 14 cards. So that's like a quarter of the deck. So then you know what cards are more available. Also, by 5th Street, you have a pretty good idea what your opponent's holding. A lot of times if the board comes dry, they started with Jack and it comes 8, a 7 and a deuce, and they continue, they probably have 2 jacks, right? Because they would have folded if they had Jack, Queen, King, or they had 3 to a suit, right? So you can also a lot of times take away another card out the deck. So you have a lot more information, and it allows you to make better decisions. It has to do with whether or not you think you have the best hand. You really want to have the best hand after 5th Street or the best draw. So Those are the things that come into play when deciding to call or raise on Fifth Street or to bet. You got to remember, in multi-way pots, just like in any game, a person's hands is usually more defined because they're in a multi-way pot. So they're not usually, they're usually drawing out a hand, or they usually have a pair of some sort. So I think instead of getting overwhelmed, they should really try to be more calm, because it's usually easier to define what your opponent has. Because usually they're not in there bluffing, because it's difficult to bluff a hand when you have to bluff through three, four players, right? So it's just kind of think, gather your thoughts. There's no need to act fast. I mean, you want to act at a reasonable rate to where you're not slowing the game down, but you need to go at your own pace. Gather your thoughts and try to figure out what everyone has, and then play accordingly. Yeah, when you're considering betting two pair in a river, I think you should almost always bet two pair when your opponent has four random cards on board. So, it's very likely they have made one pair. Also, if they have a flush draw, if they have a dry flush draw, I think a lot of times you should bet two pair, because sometimes they'll just make a pair and have to call you. And I think a lot of people don't do that enough. They think, I'm just going to go ahead and check and hope they miss. So I think there's some value there. I mean, if your opponent's the type of person that if you check to him and he misses, he's always going to bet, then you should check. But if he's the type of person that's going to check back if he misses, which a lot of people do, a lot of people just get in a rhythm and just checking back when they miss or betting if they hit, you'll see that a lot, which allows for some hero folds sometimes if your opponent's in that rhythm, which you can kind of sense. Two pair can be kind of tricky if you get into like raising two pair when someone's value betting a pair of aces or pair of kings. The best time to do that is when it looks like you're on a flush draw and you make two pair, because then they can't re-raise you. I think you should always lean towards paying off, especially if your opponent's tricky and he's capable of raising you. Then you should lean towards paying off, because again, you're getting 16, 17, 18 to 1 sometimes on the call. So you should lean towards calling. I mean, unless you're up against a guy who never ever will raise unless he's there, which you will encounter sometimes. A lot of people try to knock players out because they think their hand plays better heads up. And I'd be a little bit careful with that, because if you're playing against an experienced player and he knows you're doing that, he's going to four bet you. So you end up putting in 3 bets instead of 1. If you're going to do that, I would more so try that on 4th Street where the bets are lower. Again, that's something you need to be a little bit careful of. It's very advanced play. Also, if you have the worst hand, you do have the worst hand. Spots come up where, the initial bettor is weak and the other guy to your left has the best hand. So if he believes you have a strong hand, you can raise sometimes, put some pressure on him. Maybe he'll fold his hand. But again, these are very tricky and delicate situations, because a lot of times you end up putting more money in the pot with the worst hand and the guy won't fold, and you end up, with 3 bets back to you. One of the most brutal mistakes is they take too long to make a decision. They think it's like they think they're still playing no limit hold'em, where they need to take 20 seconds for every decision, whereas the decisions are pretty much play themselves. I mean, you have Jack 10-9 a heart on board, and if your opponent has 8-4-3, you're just going to bet. I mean, they'll take 20 seconds to make a decision there. It's like, come on, man. We're not playing no limit hold'em. There's no timing tells here. There's no need to do that. And also, the more hands that get dealt, the better it is for me. So I like to play as fast as possible, within reason. Obviously, in no limit hold'em, a lot of it has to do with acting. So sometimes you just need to play slowly. But instead, a lot of the decisions are, it doesn't matter if you play fast or not. There's some instances where you need to slow down, maybe if you're bluffing or if you want to induce a call or something like that. But within reason, it's not really a game that's meant for slow play. Some of my biggest influences in stud were definitely John Hannigan. I think he's one of the best stud players I've ever played with, for sure. Ted Forrest, amazing, amazing stud player. Chip Reese. I think those are the top of the top. When you're playing against guys like that, you really need to be sharp because you know they're not going to give nothing away. You know you really need to improve. And I was lucky enough to play with some of those guys very young in my career. And I knew that they were better than me at the time. So that made me really want to improve my game to, get to where that I can compete against them. The person I have the most fun with playing is Larry Flint. When I first came out to LA, started playing with him in the Hustler Casino. He's just always like so relaxed, so cool, always so calm, always having fun. If he's losing, if he's winning, he's pretty much the same. He likes to talk a lot of shit, and he's just fun to play with. Some things Larry said I can't repeat. I don't feel comfortable repeating. My mother might be watching, but again, he always asks me how much you're winning when you don't have any chips, or he says first your money, then your clothes. If you have your girlfriend or your wife behind you, he'll say, "What are you doing with him? I'll take better care of her than you," stuff like that. We love him for that. He's like a super funny guy.